ينظر إليهم الناظر فيحسبهم مرضى وما بقوم من مرضى. Very interesting words. He says that these individuals, because of the fear that they have of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are thin like the arrows. If anyone looks at them, they would believe or they would assume that they are sick, but they are not sick at all. Now, it's a very interesting comparison that he makes between a muttaqi and an arrow. Now, in the ancient times, even today we have this, an arrow, in order to make an arrow, to manufacture an arrow, you would cut certain wood. And you would make sure that the beam of the wood is very, very thin. On one end, a metal piercing arrow is placed. On the other hand, you have feathers. And of course, this allows to regulate the movement of the wood. Now, because one part of the arrow is heavier and the other part is very light, it helps traject the arrow and allows it to go over long distances. Now, there are two things here. Because the beam is light, the range is increased. So when you shoot the arrow, it has the ability to go far. Number two, because it's smooth, it has the ability to withhold or withstand the resistance that's there in the air. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam is explaining, he says that the muttaqi are such, it's as if the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sharpened them and has molded them in such a way that they act according to the teachings of Islam, which allows them to reach their goals. Even when there is great resistance, just as how the arrow faces resistance in the air, they're able to pass it, they're able to withstand it, and they're able to go far against the resistance. Now, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is often a subject that is quite sensitive, that people find unnerving to speak of. And there's an idea that's there presented within the Quran, within the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. The second characteristic that the Imam mentions here, which is also very, very interesting, he says that they are thin like the arrows. The person who has taqwa, their interaction with food is very, very different. At least to how you and I conventionally understand our interactions with food. You know, if you look at some of the narrations, Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, when he speaks about his grandfather, he would say that the fourth holy Imam, every night, 1,000 rak'at. He would engage in salah throughout the holy night, throughout the whole night. To such an extent that he was so thin, as he would walk in the streets, as the wind would blow against him, he would lose his balance from time to time. Now, how is that even possible? You look at the example of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Amir al-Mu'mineen, we know what type of food he would eat. Bread and water. Salt was like a luxury for him. Sometimes milk, sometimes yogurt, and so on and so forth. Very basic food. I mean, if you compare what you and I eat on a daily basis, that would be extremely lavish for Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Yet, at the same time, he would engage in salah the whole night. 1,000 raka'at, tahajjud, salat al-layl, qira'at al-Quran, so on and so forth. In daytime, he would be engaging with the public. He would spend time with his companions. He would spend time, or even more time, with some of his closer companions. He would be a teacher. He would be a judge. He would engage in battles, and battles was a big part of his life. And then, of course, you have his family life. He had wives and he had children that he had to take care of as well. And then, of course, him working and earning a wage and earning a living so that he was able to responsibly look after his family. Where did the energy come from if the Imam was just consuming such basic food? Beyond that, how many hours did the Imam sleep? You know, that's something to think about as well. Today, you find, for example, there's this idea, this notion that an average human being is in need of 8 hours. Well, if we look at the sunnah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, where are those 8 hours? When you look at, for example, a different tradition, again, attributed to Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, so whenever he would perform wudu, his skin would go yellow. When his families and his friends would see him in this state, they would say, "What's wrong with you? Why such level of fear that your skin goes yellow?" And he says, "Atadruna liman ata'ahhabu liqiyami bayna yaday." He says, "Do you not know who I am preparing to stand in front of?" Again, Imam Sadiq narrates this from Imam Bakr alayhim as-salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. They say that the fifth holy Imam, one day he was in his house and he saw his father come out from his room, and when he saw his father's eyes, they were yellow. You know, sometimes when someone grieves or has cried, you could tell from the color from their eyes. He says that my father, clearly he was in the state of grief and he had cried. said, I saw his forehead, the skin on his forehead had cracked, the skin on the tip of his nose had cracked because of the prolonged sujood. He says, I saw my father in this state. It affected me so much that I cried just by looking at him. It's very interesting. There's a profound concept of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is very much embedded within the lives of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, which can't be ignored. So what's the value of fear? You know, there's this concept or this message that can be understood from all of this, which is that the habit of the muttaqin is to fear Allah. When you look at how Allah has created us, Allah has created each and every single one of us where fear is a part of our lives. But that fear should be reserved for Allah. So when you look at, for example, those who do not have faith or those who are weak in their faith, you'll find that they are much more vulnerable to the different forms and different variations of fear. They will fear what others have to say, for example, or they fear what others think or what others will do. They fear the uncertainties of life. You know, we all go through different ups and downs in life. There's a fear towards that. There's a fear of failure, whether it be examinations, the failure of a business, whatever it may be, the fear of pain, the fear of rejection. And what all of this does is it pushes us to a life of anxiety, a life of emotional pain. So you'll find people who are afraid of negative emotions, people who are anxious, people who are tired of anticipating the unpleasant occurrences in life. This is the relationship that you and I have with fear. But when you bring in all of these narrations where the Ahlul Bayt feared Allah, what this teaches us is that this fear that is embedded within us should be reserved towards Him and Him only. A person who does have faith, or if you look at the example that I just gave with regards to people who lack faith, and this is the different types of fear that they engage in on a day-to-day basis, such fear stems from not having a correct outlook on life. When we refer to the Quran, the language of the Quran, those who have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala know that everything, every dimension of our lives are controlled by Him. Ultimately, He's in charge. So if I was to, for example, fear someone's actions, the grounding of that fear doesn't make sense. Why? Because this person doesn't have control over his own life. Why should I fear him? It all goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ultimately, He is in charge and He is in control. There's a very interesting verse of the Holy Quran. Allah says, لَأَنْتُمْ أَشَدُّ رَحْبَةً فِي صُدُورِهِمْ مِنَ اللَّهِ ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ قَوْمٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ. He speaks about the hypocrites, and he says the characteristics of the hypocrites is that they fear you, meaning the Prophet and the Muslimin. The hypocrites are the ones who fear the Muslimin, and they don't have fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The reason why they don't have fear of Allah is because they do not have a level of understanding. They have failed to develop their knowledge to know that Allah is the one to be feared. Now when you look at the munafiqeen, when you look at, for example, the verse itself, the verse says that they had intense rahba. Rahba is a sense of fear, or is a state of fear which is infused with nervousness, anxiety, and so on and so forth. Khashya, often translated as fear, is different. Khashya is when you fear someone because of the awe and the power that they have. So, for example, a person may fear a king because of the power that a king may have. So the two fears, rahba and khashya, is very, very different. Although it's similar in different ways, it's also different. Now the hypocrites, when they saw the believers, they understood their qualities, that they were very much embedded with determination, they had strength, they were fearless. So when the munafiqeen often came up with plans to confront the Muslims, they would often sit back down. Why? Because of the characteristics of the Muslimin. They feared the reaction of the Muslimin. So some things never materialized. Allah condemns them, saying that you feared the Muslimin, whereas you did not reserve that fear for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That quality and the attributes of the Muslimin, where did it come from? It stemmed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the one who gave it to them. Munafiqeen, you have failed to recognize the qualities of Allah, the power and the authority of Allah. You have failed to recognize the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If they understood that nothing can harm or benefit a human being except what Allah wills, their attitude would be very, very much different. And this is a misconception or a misunderstanding that often we develop within our lives. The idea that others can harm us. You know, it robs us from our peace, from our security, from our tranquility, and it makes us very much agitated and fearful. In contrast to those who believe in Allah and know that everything stems from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing will materialize unless Allah wills it so. In the ayah of the Holy Quran, it's a dua that we engage in. Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil. Sufficient is Allah. Allah is enough for us because He is the one who decides all of the different affairs. When we speak about pure Tawheed, the true manifestations of Tawheed, a believer, you know, it's required that when certain choices and certain actions have to be made, a believer would do what he's responsible for. But then he will leave the actions in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He will leave the consequences of the actions in the hands of Allah. So if, for example, a person has to make a decision or to act, and he knows that in the process he will please Allah but also displease the people around him, he's not moved by this. And he knows that Allah is there alongside him and is ready to support him. The fear of going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is much more of a concern. It's of a greater concern within their hearts than to seek the pleasure of the people around him. They fear only Allah in their hearts. And it is not combined with the fear of anyone else. It is not possible to have two fears in one heart. There's a very interesting hadith, and I'll end with this, where the Ma'sum says, "Man kathurat makhafatu qallat afatu." It says the one who has or develops the fear of Allah, a natural consequence of that is that his afflictions will decrease. Of course, there are many stages and many different dimensions to this discussion. Inshallah, we'll carry on next week. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr. إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي لا مضاد له في ملكه ولا منازع له في أمره. الحمد لله الذي لا شريك له في خلقه ولا شبيه له في عظمته. نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. جاء من عنده مصدقا للمرسلين خلف فينا راية الحق عليا وأولاده المعصومين حجج الله إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. There's a very interesting ayah of the Holy Quran when Allah begins to speak about the attribute of the Holy Prophet. He says, وَلَكِنْ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ وَخَاتِمِ النَّبِيِّينَ. He says the Prophet is indeed a messenger of Allah. And at the same time, he is the seal of all of the other prophets. Now, there's a very specific message that is being delivered here, which is that the religion of Islam supersedes all of the previous religions that have come before. He is the seal of the prophets. And we see the effects of Islam and Islamic teachings on a global platform more so today than in the previous generations. The number of converts, for example, are now increasing. People are embracing the religion of Islam. You have, for example, there was a phase for many, many decades where Orientalists and historians, when examining Islamic history, they would come to the conclusion that Islam was spread by the sword. And of course, this was very easily debunked simply because, well, nothing succeeds if it stems from violence. Is there any movement that you and I are aware of that has been successful, considering the fact that they use violence to spread that specific message? Another message that we can get from this verse is that there is no religion or major religion that has been introduced after Islam. Again, Rasulullah is Khatim al-Nabiyyin, the seal of all of the prophets. Many have attempted to present religions but were quickly dissolved over the period of time. Now, the manifestation of the glory of Islam can be most clearly seen during the season of Hajj. It is as if during the season of Hajj, during the processes of Hajj, it's as if the culture of Islam resonates the best. Having said this, unfortunately, you'll find that one can easily observe very strong anti-Islamic sentiments that people have towards the religion of Islam. And if we were to draw our attention towards the recent events which have transpired in India in the past week or so, it raises a number of pertinent questions. For example, why is it that within Indian politics there's this hatred and resentment and animosity towards Muslims? And why is it not being covered by mainstream media? In fact, it's quite the opposite. Such levels of hatred and provocative speech is widespread on social media, yet there is silence from Western mainstream media. I'll give you a few examples to illustrate this. Over the past few years, we've observed a rise of violence against Muslims in India. According to a recent study, at least 55.12% of Islamophobic content is coming from India. Hate tweets, it's all emanating from India. And this has an effect on other parts of the world, outside of India, for example, in Europe and in North America, and so on and so forth. As an example, there was an article published by the BBC dating back January 2022, which spoke of a militant Hindu priest by the name of Yati Saraswati. Forgive me if I get the pronunciation wrong. So Yati Saraswati publicly came forward in front of he's a priest, by the way. He publicly presents himself in front of his followers and he makes these ridiculous statements. For example, he says that there has to be an attempt to mobilize the entire world to invade the temple of Mecca. Now, this is very strong, provocative speech. Now, of course, it's nonsensical to make such statements, but such statements are being made by public official politicians, by public ministers of religion representing a specific political party. With regards to today's discussion, I want to talk about Bollywood. Slowly, for those of you who are fans of Bollywood, you would have noticed a trend that's being picked up very, very strong. It's very strong and it's quite rampant. Slowly, more and more productions are being created to drive through a very strong anti-Islamic message. And it's constantly perpetuating myths and stereotypes about Muslims. And all of this is with the goal of dehumanizing Muslims and attempting to invalidate Islam. So there was an interesting article published by Time.com earlier this year in January 2023, how Bollywood rolled over to Hindu supremacists. If we were to compare Bollywood alongside Hollywood, Bollywood, the audience of Bollywood is nearly 3 billion. They get 3 billion, so they attract 3 billion viewers each year. And that's remarkably more than what Hollywood attracts each year. Last year, there was a movie that was released, The Kashmir Files. And it's a very provocative production which portrayed Muslims in a very negative limelight. The basis of the movie was to recall a Hindu genocide by the hands of the Muslims in the 1990s. But it never took place. The incident never took place. There was no genocide against the Hindus by the hands of the Muslims. But the effect of the movie was that, according to some reports, single-handedly fueled rage towards the Muslims. This year, within the week, a second movie was released amongst all of the different movies, The Kerala Story. Of course, this was released just within the week. Now, The Kerala Story tells the story of how Muslims are committing love jihad. What's love jihad? Love jihad is where Muslims are now forcibly converting Hindu women to become Muslims and forcing them to become brides of ISIS jihadists. So the film itself looks into the account of 3 women very, very loosely of how they lived in the city of Kerala. They were forced to become Muslims, and then later they were moved to Afghanistan to join ISIS and become brides of ISIS jihadists. Now, apparently, the film very advocately and very strongly pushes the idea that 32,000 women in total have been victims of love jihad. Well, it seems that this statistic is not backed by any real evidence. In fact, there was research done which claimed that the figures were widely inaccurate. It was based on mistranslations, misquotations, extrapolations, misrepresentations from unrelated statistics. According to some research, they said that in India, approximately 200 Indians had joined ISIS. And the population from Kerala was a quarter from that 200. So unfortunately, this does happen. We've seen it happen within the UK. Unfortunately, it does happen, and we denounce it wholeheartedly. If you look at what happened in the UK, when there were certain members who joined ISIS, for example, there were a handful of them. The media picked it up very clearly, and the media expanded on it, and it was on the news for days, weeks, some may even argue. But 32,000, that's a remarkable number coming from one single city in India. So why is it that the media has not picked up on this? Ultimately, the movie is fallacious. The movie is based on false presumptions, false assumptions, is based on false statistics. But people assume it to be true simply because it is marketed as true. The film is now being marketed as based on true real-life events and true stories. As a result, Muslims are being attacked. So again, there was an article, again, by the Times.com, why India's most populous state just passed a law inspired by an anti-Muslim conspiracy theory. So now laws are being legislated within India based on false assumptions and false realities, which of course is driven by such movies. Unfortunately, Bollywood is known for propagating hate. There's a direct article from Al Jazeera dating back 2019, Bollywood and the Politics of Hate. The Indian film industry has displayed remarkable bias in favor of the ruling BJP ahead of this year's elections. If we were to come back to Hajj, Hajj promotes its own culture. It promotes a culture of coexistence. It promotes a culture of one of the greatest manifestations of what can be seen through Hajj. It breaks barriers of race, it breaks barriers of culture, traditions, and languages, and it promotes peace. What we see happening in India is no longer a national problem. It's being seen on a global platform as well. It's an international problem as well. So even all of us who are sitting here, we're always and constantly presented with different worldviews, of different paradigms, of different cultures, traditions, all through social media, the news, and through different entertainment avenues. If the practices of what we're being presented is in line with what Islam promotes and the teachings of Islam, فَبِهَا وَنِعْمَةً, we take it on board. But what happens in the situation when such practices and ideologies are in active opposition against the teachings of Islam? What do we do here? Do we sit down and expect Islam to change, to nurture, or to change and mold itself according to what society is telling us? Is that the approach that we ought to expect? Or do we revise? At least we should try and understand which of the two cultures that are being presented to us is closer to the reality, is stronger. Which of the two cultures has the potential to nurture a strong community that can preserve human values? That's a key fundamental question that we ought to ask ourselves. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on this. And since it is a Friday, to hasten the reappearance of the Imam of our time, أجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. اللهم صل على عبدك ورسولك سيد المرسلين ورسول رب العالمين محمد المصطفى صلى الله عليه وآله. وعلى أمير المؤمنين ووسي رسول رب العالمين علي المرتضى عليه السلام. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى سيدة النساء العالمين وبدءة الخاتم النبيين فاطمة الزهراء عليه السلام. وعلى سيد شباب أهل الجنة الحسن المجتبى والحسين سيد الشهداء عليه السلام. عليهم السلام. وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة بن الحسن قائم المنتظر المهدي. اللهم صل على محمد. أرواحنا وأرواح العالمين له الفداء. اللهم افتح له فتحا يسيرا وانصره نصرا عزيزا. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات. وآخر دعوانا عن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصل اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن محمد رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر.
الله أكبر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين حملوا التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا. بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذي تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائمة. قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. لا إله إلا الله الحليم الكريم. لا إله إلا الله رب العرش العظيم. لا إله إلا الله العلي العظيم. سبحان الله رب السماوات السبع ورب الأرضين السبع وما فيهن وما بينهن ورب العرش العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي. صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي. صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي. صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. كذلك الله ربي. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر.
الله أكبر.
الله أكبر.
لا إله إلا الله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا إله إلا الله إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. لا إله إلا الله ولا نعبد إلا إياه مخلصين له الدين وله كره المشركون. لا إله إلا الله ربنا ورب آبائنا الأولين. لا إله إلا الله وحده أنجز وحده ونصر عبدا وعز جندا وهزم الأحزاب وحدا. فله الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت ويميت ويحيي وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. حي على خير العمل. حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة. قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر.
الله أكبر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا الله يا رحمن يا رحيم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلبي على دينك. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بحول الله وقوته. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. أستغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم يا لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. الله أكبر. الحمد لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا اللهم صل على تسبيح فاطمة الزهراء سلام عليه. محمد وآل محمد صلوات. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بحق محمد وآل محمد. अपना मजे भाइयों बहनों बच्चों बीमार हो अपने दुआ करे कि अल्लाह लोग का बदाई ने शफा दे बदाई ने तकलीफ़ों दूर थाए अपना आलिमो मर्जा मोमिनीन मोमिनात दुनिया में जहाँ भी हो या अल्लाह तो अलग हिफ्ज़ व अमान में रख हमारी बदी हाजतों पूरी कर हमारा इल्म वधारू कर एवी दुआ साथी आपणे बद्दा साथे 5 फेरे अम्मा युजीब पढ़िए। औज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम। बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम। अम्मा युजीबुल मुस्तर्रा इज़ा दअाहु أَمَّنْ يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ 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 سورة فاتحة شفاء المرضى ودفع البلاء.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الأول قبل الإنشاء والأحياء والآخر بعد فناء الأشياء العليم الذي لا ينسى من ذكره ولا ينقص من شكره ولا يخيب من دعاه ولا يقطع رجاء من رجاه. اللهم إني أشهدك وكفى بك شهيدا وأشهد جميع ملائكتك وسكان سماواتك وحملة عرشك ومن بعثت من أنبيائك ورسلك وأنشأت من أصناف خلقك أني أشهد أنك أنت الله لا إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك ولا عديل ولا خلف لقولك ولا تبديل وأن محمد صلى الله عليه وآله عبدك ورسولك الدائم حملته إلى العباد وجاهد في الله عز وجل حق الجهاد وأنه بشر بما هو حق من الثواب وأنذر بما هو صدق من العقاب. اللهم ثبتني على دينك ما أحييتني ولا تذق قلبي بعد إذ هديتني وهب لي من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. صل على محمد وآل محمد واجعلني من أتباعه وشيعته واحشرني في زمرته ووفقني لأداء فرض الجمعات وما أوجبت علي فيها من الطاعات وقسمت لأهلها من العطاء في يوم الجزاء إنك أنت العزيز الحكيم. صلوات.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا رسول الله، السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين، السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء، السلام عليك يا خديجة الكبرى، السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى، السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله الحسين، ولا تسأة المعصومين من ذريتك علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. السلام عليك يا حجة الله في عرزي، السلام عليك يا عين الله في خلقي، السلام عليك يا نور الله الذي يهتدي به المهتدون ويفرج به عن المؤمنين. السلام عليك أيها المحزب الخائف، السلام عليك أيها الولي الناصح، السلام عليك يا سفينة النجاة، السلام عليك يا عين الحياة، السلام عليك صلى الله عليك وعلى آل بيتك الطيبين الطاهرين. السلام عليك عجل الله لك ما بعدك من النصر وظهور الأمر. السلام عليك يا مولاي أنا مولاك، عارف بأولاك وأخراك، أتقرب إلى الله تعالى بك وبعلى بيتك وأنتظر ظهورك وظهور الحق على يديك، وأسأل الله أن يصلي على محمد وآل محمد وأن يجعلني من المنتصرين لك والتابعين والناصرين لك على أعدائك والمستشهدين بين يديك في جملة أوليائك. يا مولاي يا صاحب الزمان، صلوات الله عليك وعلى بيتك. هذا يوم الجمعة وهو يومك المتوقع في ظهورك والفرج فيه للمؤمنين على يديك وقتل الكافرين بسيفك، وأنا يا مولاي فيه سيفك وجارك، وأنت يا مولاي كريم من أولاد الكرام ومأمور بالزيافة والإجارة، فأعزفني وأجرني. صلواتك علي وعلى أهل بيتك الطاهرين. السلام عليك يا أهل بيت النبوة جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم كن لوليك حجة من حسن، صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة، وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه أرزق طوءا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.